This is the Kratom Science Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for KratomScience.com, your source for all things Kratom. You've heard of HBO's documentary, The Crime of the Century. Well, this is the other crime of the century. In a hysterical overcorrection of the opioid crisis, the DEA has been threatening doctors who prescribe opioid pain medication based solely on voluntary CDC guidelines. Multiple chronic pain patients have contemplated and committed suicide. Some have turned to Kratom. Dr. Thomas Kline from Raleigh, North Carolina is here to talk about the state-sanctioned torture of pain patients. A lot of people have discovered Kratom because they've actually been cut off of opioids by their doctors in recent years. And so there's a lot of documentaries about, the overprescription opioid crisis. But now there's kind of an underprescription crisis, which is what you're talking about. And just how widespread and how bad is this crisis?
Well, according to the government, there are 10 million people, 3% of the population, that have the need to take opiate pain medicine every day. And they didn't say who they were because they don't know. So we did a survey, and 97% of people who are taking daily pain medicines have long-term painful diseases. And these are diseases like CRPS, complex regional pain disease, interstitial cystitis of the bladder, adhesive arachnoiditis of the inflammation of the covering over the spine, disastrous multi-joint arthritis that cannot be treated with anything else, ulcerative colitis, sickle cell anemia. These are all rare diseases. They're lifelong, they're permanent, and they need permanent treatment. We treat cardiac disease with cardiac medicine, and so we should treat painful disease with pain medicine. So there are 3 surveys that suggest more than 70% of people have been reduced. Half of those have been taken off. So if you multiply that times 10 million people, we have a humanitarian crisis of 6 to 7 million people, unverified by the government because they don't want to know. The CDC was required 3 months before they published their guidelines to be sure to follow up for any unintended consequences. They've been notified for the past 4 years that there is a real serious problem because doctors believe that the CDC guidelines are law. And so they're taking people off their medicines to what end? To fight the opioid crisis. See, the mythology starts to get real fuzzy when you actually ask questions like, how does taking people off their medicines they've been on for 10 years for their permanent chronic painful disease going to help with the overdose crisis? Well, if I were sitting here with a government official, what would they say? It's hard to imagine what they would say. They would say things like, well, overprescribing causes addiction and overdose. Well, where's the proof for that? So what happened was actually an experiment was done by the CDC. In other words, they said that the number of overdose deaths is running parallel to the number of prescriptions written, and therefore the prescriptions are causing the overdose deaths. That's the same logic as cheese is yellow, the moon is yellow, therefore the moon is made of cheese. So it's a hypothesis, and anybody can have a hypothesis. I could have a hypothesis that the world is flat. But then my next step is to prove it. Now, you prove it in two ways. You can do an experiment, or you can use logic that was given to us by Socrates. It's a mathematical system of asking questions and using rules of logic. Mm-hmm. So they actually did an experiment by tricking doctors into believing these are horrible drugs, and if they prescribe too many, they're going to get arrested by the federal drug police. We've actually had a drop of 30% in the prescriptions written. That's a lot. And they think that's a good idea. What it's done is it's caused harm in 6 to 7 million people. That's the result of the 30%. So now that the prescriptions have dropped 30%, we must see a 30% drop in overdose deaths. Oops, it's gone up. So at that point, you stop doing the experiment. This is kind of like in medicine when we're conducting a study and things start to go wrong. What do? You stop it. So the experiment's gone wrong. You stop it immediately to prevent more harm. The AMA, the American Medical Association, wrote a letter to the CDC and said, you know what? This is causing a lot of harm to patients. And the CDC said, nothing.
Why do you think that is? I mean, once they see like some of this evidence that I guess, people are turning to illegal drugs for their pain and then they don't know what's in it, and is that what's causing most of the overdoses? And why aren't they acting with this new information?
Well, I guess the next question would be to ask and reporters don't do this for some reason, and I'll tell you in a minute why I think they don't. So the CDC says 80,000 drug overdoses this year. Okay, how many of those involved opiates? Oh, about 60,000. So not 80,000, about 60,000. And who are they? If I said that 2,600 people died in Wyoming last year, the next question would be, who died? So if you ask the CDC that, and they've never mentioned this, actually 95% of the overdose deaths are in people with heroin disease. These are people dying on the streets because they don't have medical treatment. We only provide 20% of people with heroin disease treatment. Now, we're talking about opiate addiction. We're not talking about any other addictions right now because that's what the government's focused on. Why is the government focused on heroin addiction, opiate addiction, when in fact it's much more dangerous when people are addicted to cocaine and amphetamines and alcohol? Mm-hmm. That's where the serious crime occurs. If you look at serious crime, you find that heroin and marijuana are at the bottom of the list. So why are we focused on this and not focused on methamphetamine? Methamphetamine really does destroy people. So the answer to that is that we have an inbuilt, deeply ingrained fear of addiction, phobia. Mm-hmm. Now, phobia is a mental illness in which you have excessive fear and then you avoid what it is you're afraid of. Mm-hmm. If you're afraid to drive over a bridge, that's excessive fear. And so you avoid driving over bridges. So what we do is, rather than avoiding it, people aren't getting addicted. What we do is we make sure nobody else gets addicted. So in other words, we would put up a sign and say, nobody gets to drive over this bridge because I'm afraid to drive over the bridge. So with a fear of opiate addiction, that's what's behind everything. So in other words, if you say, why are they doing this? That's the answer.
Yeah.
They've got senators running around saying these absurd things. Like, for example, treatment of addicts. Are you kidding? You're going to give dope to dopers? We're not going to allow that. So they don't allow it. And so you read about all this money being spent going to treatment. What it's going to the rehab industry.
Yeah.
The rehab complex industry, like the complex military thing that Eisenhower talked about. Military, what do we call
industrial.
it? Rehab. Industrial. Yeah, that's it. Same thing. Why are we not treating people? Because we have a rehab industry that makes a lot of money, $1,000 a day. That's an awful lot of money. It doesn't cost that much to be in the ICU at most hospitals. So why are they getting away with it? Well, guess what? Rehab is not regulated. Nursing homes are regulated. Hospitals are regulated. Pain clinics theoretically are regulated. Doctors' offices are regulated. Dentists are regulated. All healthcare is regulated, except for rehab. Now, they don't want it regulated because they've got a nice little revolving door going. What they do is you go into the rehab, you don't get a choice of what they do. So a lot of times you have to be clean to go in. You have to be free of your drugs.
Yeah.
So you go off of your medicine that they're taking by themselves, their heroin or other opiates, and you go in, and then they take $30,000 from you for a month's treatment, and then they send you home. So most people with heroin disease will start shooting up immediately once they're out, and if they don't die, which a lot do die, then they're going to go back into rehab. This becomes a business model to beat all business models. So then another $30,000 a month, and they never really have a definitive treatment program. Sadly, you cannot get rid of heroin addiction, opiate addiction, because it's hardwired in the brain. You can stop an addiction to marijuana, to cocaine and amphetamines, and even alcohol, and you'll be fine. But heroin disease is permanent. And it's permanent because it's hardwired in the brain, and it's inherited in the family.
Yeah.
So the reason everything is such a mess is because people have not realized that there's really two groups of addiction, the heroin disease addiction, and then the other group. But they're very different. But we're only focused on the heroin because it's in our fabric. We believe that a person with addiction disease is a junkie. The mental image of a junkie in the United States is worse than anybody else. It's worse than sex offenders. It's worse than atomic spies. It's worse than killers. It's just a terrible, terrible vision. That's because only families have really met heroin disease people. And in order to find their medicine, because it's a disease, no reason not to call it a medicine. And by the way, heroin is a painkiller. It's called diamorphine. We used to use it. It's a great drug. It's about the same as oxycodone. Except in 1925, the government felt if we just get all the substance off the street, we'll cure the problem. And they made heroin illegal for all uses, including us doctors. So the fear of addiction phobia started at the turn of the century during Puritan times, when women were put up on pedestals and they weren't allowed to go to high school and they had to wear long dresses.
Yeah.
Because Randolph Hearst, who sold a lot of newspapers telling lies, made up a story about white women going into opium dens in San Francisco and then running off with Chinese owners and men. That wasn't true. Chinese men don't want to run off with white women. But he lied and made up the story. So remember now, it's 1900. So this becomes a intense moral issue. White women losing their virtue by smoking opium.
Yeah.
So now the next thing that happened is a couple of fanatics, a doctor by the name of Hamilton and a Episcopal minister, forgot his name, but anyway, they started to rant, rave, and go to Congress and convince the president and everything that this is terrible. Our society is going down the toilet. Sounds just like stuff you hear today. Communities are affected. Down the toilet. People are immoral. A lot of words like immoral. So in 1914, they passed the law, which a lot of people didn't really want to pass, and they tried to regulate narcotics for the very first time by putting a tax on them and making doctors register and write down when they did it. And guess what started on the streets? Heroin.
Yeah.
Heroin is cheap. You could buy it across the counter until that time. By regulating it, what happened is the price shot up on all the other products. So that's when the heroin started. There were 200,000 addicts at the time. And that was about 0.5% or less than 1% of the population. So today we have, guess how many heroin addicts? Heroin disease people. We have 800,000. Mm-hmm. But if you correct it, and what the rate is, what we call the prevalence, what percentage of the population has this particular disease? Less than 1%.
Yeah.
It's frighteningly the same. It's 4 people per 1,000 was in 1920 and now is today. So what that tells us as doctors, if you have a disease that has a constant prevalence, there's only one way that can be, and it has to be inherited or genetic. Rates for other addictions like cocaine and amphetamines bounce around from year to year. They're not the same all the time.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that people really don't want to hear this, but heroin disease people get their disease triggered on the first pill. Mm. And that's because it's genetically triggered. We have another disease, it's an anemia, it's kind of rare, it's called G6PD. In other words, you have the genetics running around in your body for this disease and nothing happens until you take a certain antibiotic or you eat fava beans. All of a sudden that triggers a hemolytic anemia. You start destroying your red blood cells. So that's kind of a little parallel we have. And well, people say, oh, that's crap. Why don't they just stop? Well, it's part of the disease.
Yeah.
There's a physician in Boston, an internist, loved practicing medicine, one of those people born to the stethoscope. He's in his 30s and he takes a Vicodin and all of a sudden he goes to the moon on the first pill. And I asked him the other day, I said, what was it like? He said, I went to the moon. It was really something else. I was talking to an addict out in, we're going to stop using that word, addict, person with heroin disease out in Portland, Oregon.
Okay, thanks, because I'm trying to learn the right words too.
Yeah, we got to get away from these pejorative words. Yeah. So it's heroin disease.
You also said misuse or abuse is also loaded.
Loaded word. Yeah, it's the quartet: misuse, abuse, overdose, addiction, and I forget what the fifth one is. They always put them together because when people are frightened and they don't know what's going on, they latch on to words. Mm. So the big word that's been latched onto is misuse. So a person with heroin disease, are they misusing the opiates? Yes, because misuse is defined as taking a medicine for no medical reason. In other words, there's no disease, but actually they have a disease, but we'll stick with misuse. So people with heroin disease misuse the drug. So then they turn it around. The moon is made of cheese. And they say, therefore, if you misuse a drug, you're an addict. So then the government decides and uses the definition of misuse. It used to be if you're using a drug for non-medical reasons, but they changed it in 2015. They changed the definition of misuse to not taking the prescription the way it says on the bottle. So they run around every year and they do these interviews and they go and they pay people $35, which, by the way, if you're a surveyor, you never do. That biases your, they're going to tell you what you want, if you give them money.
Yeah.
So anyway, they ask and they say, all right, now, how many of you have had an opiate prescription? A lot of hands go up because there's about 96 million prescriptions written every year for opiates. That's a lot. So then they say, okay, if you've got an opiate prescription, they have these little laptops they carry around, they punch in the answers. If you have had an opiate prescription, did you take it in a way that was different than written on the bottle? So the bottle says 1 pill every 6 hours. Well, anybody in pain needs to actually regulate their medicine according to their pain. And it's so safe that you can actually do that. So in other words, if it's real bad, you can take 2 or 3, within the limits that you agree upon with your physician. So now, it's last week I had to take an extra one. Bingo, press the button. Abuser.
Oh, man.
Misuser. I always tell a funny story about abuse. The original word abuse was a sexual word, and it had to do with masturbation.
No, not that.
You're abusing yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
I went to Catholic school, so I think I heard that a couple times.
Okay, well, here's how it got started. Back in Boston, in the Massachusetts Bay Company and the Puritans, several boys were caught masturbating. And do you know what the penalty for self-abuse was? They sent these teenagers back to England, away from their families. They got rid of them. So whenever I see the word abuse, I always have to laugh. Abuse is not a medical word. Misuse is not a medical word. And overprescription is not a medical word. They're not in our lexicon. Mm-hmm. People are making these up who are not doctors. And they're playing doctor. And they're saying that people that misuse drugs are going to end up becoming addicted. And then so the Socratic way, the next question is, and tell me how that happens. Mm-hmm. You see, what they've done is they've reversed the logic, which you can't do. That's a no-no in the rules of logic. And so, but every doper I've ever talked to misuses their drugs. Okay, true. So now let's go to people that don't have the disease and they misuse their drug. So what happens? They get high doses, and high doses cause more addiction. Well, how come we don't have more addicts? We got the same as we had in 1920. But now we prescribe 250 million prescriptions to 95 million different people.
Mm.
So if, I would think that we'd have half the country out shooting up behind dumpsters, but we don't.
Yeah.
Why don't we? Well, we don't because it's a triggered disease. So
yeah.
How about other addictions? So we have to call those addictions. It's not opiate addiction, but it is amphetamine addiction.
Mm-hmm.
How does that happen? That's a behavioral circumstance. People start taking medicines like amphetamines and cocaine. Cocaine is a medicine, not used very much, but marijuana is the biggie, and alcohol. People take alcohol every day after work because they feel like shit and they want to feel better. So they take something to make them feel better.
Mm-hmm.
So you see that group, we call this type 1 addiction group.
So it's like type 1 and type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, there you go. And it's interesting that in diabetes, they didn't realize there was a second type for 40 years.
Mm.
When insulin was invented, they just assumed anybody with a high blood sugar needed insulin and they had diabetes. And then they finally realized, oops, there's two kinds. And the second kind was called non-insulin dependent diabetes or adult diabetes. So same thing, same name, there's similarities, but they are way, way different diseases.
Mm.
So if we look at the group where substance may make things worse, like amphetamines, if you control the ingredients to make methamphetamine, you're probably going to reduce the number of people that get so used to taking this stuff that they call it addiction. Now, we define addiction differently because there's two kinds, and it's very important that the difference be realized. The first group of addiction light, let's say, can still cause extremely serious problems. So our definition is addiction type 1 is involvement with a substance or activity to the degree that it ruins your daily life.
Mm.
So in other words, if you are drinking, a case of beer on the weekends, passing out unconscious, and then Monday you go to work, and there's no other consequences, like, you're spending enough time with your family because you're drunk. If there's no other consequences, you don't have an addiction.
Yeah.
So, but with heroin and opiates, because it's hardwired, you do have the disease. And our old word addiction needs to be thrown away because, see, it's completely different than the group 1. The group 1 is behavioral.
Yeah. And
there are pathways in the brain, but those are the same pathways you get from if you like to eat too many chocolates.
Yeah.
You're getting reinforced, and they found those pathways, but they're different than the pathways in the heroin disease. And it does take a while. So the observation has been, gee whiz, to really get into a bad situation with cocaine, you got to really do it a lot over a long period of time, and then you ruin your daily life. Mm-hmm. So the assumption is passed over to type 2 heroin disease. If you take opiates for a long period of time, you will become addicted. Oops. That's why it's important to separate these two. And then your analogy with diabetes is true. People with type 2 diabetes are being treated with insulin, and they should not be because they don't need it. Like type 1, you have to have insulin or you die. So the fear then becomes overprescribing.
Yeah.
Now, overprescribing is not a term that we doctors use. It's not in our lexicon. If I was talking to another doctor and I said, George, I think you're overprescribing, what I would mean was that he was giving out too many antidepressants to people that don't need it. But the government feels that overprescribing is such a serious offense, doctors go to prison. There was a doctor sent to prison for 3 years this week because he prescribed 2 million pills.
Wow.
Wait a minute now. Is this a federal offense, prescribing too many pills? And what is too many? If I say that the neighbor has too many bushes in his yard, there has to be some kind of standard. More than 10, more than 15. So the sad, ironic thing is, to treat people with chronic pain, you have to give them a medicine every 4 hours. There's no other drugs that I know of, I've been doing this 40 years, that you have to give every 4 hours. Mm-hmm. So if you have high blood pressure, you take 1 pill a day. And if you have painful disease, you take it 6 times a day. So right away, you're taking 6 times more. Yeah. And ironically, the highest dose for oxycodone, which is our best and most reliable and least expensive pain medicine, is 1 pill is usually not enough. Mm-hmm. Because they don't make a 60 milligram pill. Isn't that ironic? They only make a 30. So some of my patients were taking 3 or even 4 every 6 hours.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, these are that sounds like a lot, and people really get nervous. Mm-hmm. But now we got to go back to the FDA. They're in charge of regulating prescription drugs. Yeah. So if you really want to find out what too much is, you go to the FDA. So I've just given, let's say, 200 milligrams of an antidepressant to somebody, and the FDA says the maximum is 100. So the FDA is going to say, well, Kline, you're prescribing too much. So then you ask the same question and you say, all right, so I'm giving oxycodone, and I'm giving them, 30 a day, 900 a month, right?
Yeah.
And so I say to the FDA, is that too much? And the FDA says, we don't have a limit. Mm-hmm. So it's not too much because there's no comparison. There's no rule.
Yeah.
There's, the guy next door could have 900 bushes in his yard.
Yeah.
Because there's no standard. If the city had a rule, we can't have more than 10 bushes, then we got a problem. He's prescribing, he's putting in too many bushes.
So why is the CDC even involved when it's the FDA's jurisdiction to tell you, what you can do with food and drugs?
This is like the agriculture department building an aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
In other words, the federal government is set up to help us citizens. We're the ones that set it up. And so then what they do is they create agencies. Mm-hmm. And then when they create the agency, there's a law that creates the agency. They give the agency what's called rulemaking authority. That means they can pass regulations that have the effect of law. So each agency gets a long list of rulemaking authority. Now, the CDC's rulemaking authority, which you can look up, has to do with controlling epidemics and, mm-hmm. Blah, 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 long thing. But there's nothing on the CDC mission statement, anything to do with any prescription drugs or the practice of medicine at all. Mm-hmm. They can let out regulations or, don't sell turtles, that haven't been checked for salmonella. And they can put out these kinds of regulations to help with infectious disease. So they basically did what Washington calls informal regulation. That's the term they use. Mm-hmm. That means they're doing it wrong. That means they're making up regulations and they have no authority. So the CDC published a 50-page single-spaced document that nobody in this country has read because I've been working on it for more than a year. Mm-hmm. And buried on page 3, I think, in an unrelated paragraph is the word voluntary. And if you word scan the entire 50 pages, you'll find the word voluntary is in there one time.
Yeah.
Gets them off the hook. See, so they're unauthorized. Nobody authorized them to do this. Congress didn't authorize them, and they don't have their own internal authorization because they don't have rulemaking. So it is very fair to say these are unauthorized guidelines. Now, from a medical standpoint, they're the weirdest guidelines I ever read because it doesn't tell you when to use the medicine. Mm-hmm. It only tells you when not to use it.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, no, we didn't say taper. And we're not responsible for this. It was misread. But the word taper, if you word search that, is in there 42 times. Mm. Now, in my textbook that I have, my pharmacology textbook, on the section on opiates, the word taper is in there once. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like, how do you get somebody off these medicines? Let's say if they have suddenly develop an allergic reaction or something, you got to get them off.
Yeah.
Taper's in there once. The word overdose death, or the pair of words overdose death, is in the CDC guidelines 140 times. So guess what they're worried about? They're worried about overdoses, and somebody said the other day, and by calling it an epidemic, then they can grab it as a, this is in our jurisdiction.
Oh, okay. So that's their rationale. Yeah.
And they do have an injury section. They got into the business of poisonings and injuries somehow way back. Mm-hmm. So the overdose deaths become poisonings. So you see, they do have rulemaking about poisonings. So they are definitely not doing this properly. This is the FDA is the agency with rulemaking authority. Mm-hmm. And so when the FDA says oxycodone has no limit, states cannot make laws to say that, there's one state that says you can only have 120 oxycodone a month. That's what we call, what do we call it? When you're overruling the federal government.
Insurrection. I
don't know. Okay, I'll think of it in a minute. You can't do that. The Constitution has a supremacy clause that says, you can make all the laws you want, use state standards, as long as you're not making a law that contradicts one of our federal laws.
Yeah.
You can't do that. This is what got us into the Civil War. See, the states started to nullify. That's it, nullification. The states started to nullify federal laws. You can't do that. So when a state passes a law and it says you can only have 120 oxycodone a month, they are now in violation of the supremacy clause and should be struck down immediately. But nobody does that. Why? Fear of addiction phobia.
Yeah. And
when go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask, so you mentioned a doctor that was arrested. I mean, how much pressure are they feeling from this, and are they, what kind of threats are they getting if they prescribe this stuff? And is that what's behind all the underprescription, or is it just the fear in general?
Well, we did a little survey and we asked patients, what did the doctors tell you that the reason for this was? And the majority of them said the CDC and the DEA. The attorney generals in the states are sending out letters to doctors. I know a physician up around the Great Lakes who had a gigantic pain practice. 25 DEA agents came to his practice and raided him looking for information because he was the number one prescriber in the state. Mm. He was the number one prescriber because he had the largest practice. So the government believes that overprescribing, too much medicine will cause more heroin addiction. And that's why it's important to know there's a difference. If the government wants to control cocaine, they're going to get less cocaine addiction. But it's not working, because they don't understand that there's this difference. And we have written a little paper on it. And the majority of doctors who read it think that that can't be right. But this is part of a book written by Thomas Kuhn, Kuhn, a long time ago, called The Scientific Revolution. We were required to read it in medical school. It's what happens when a new idea comes. Like the fact the Earth really rotates around the sun.
Yeah.
I mean, they were going to kill Galileo.
Yeah.
And and you know what he said right before they get ready to sentence him? He said, "You know what? I think you're right. I think the sun rotates around the Earth." He saved his life. They still put him under house arrest in his home in Italy, wherever. So it's kind of that. It's very, very powerful. In other words, if people say that opiates are safe, then they take their licenses away from them. That's what happened to me.
Wow.
In other words, I tweeted that not everybody can be addicted. The Mayo Clinic, if you go to their website, it says anybody can become addicted. Addicted to what?
Yeah.
Anybody can become addicted to marijuana and use it too much and ruin their lives, but not everybody can become have a disease called heroin disease. Not everybody, only less than 1%. It's governed by your own genes. In other words, your genes actually protect you from becoming, falling into this bad trap, except for less than 1%. The genes don't protect them anymore. They get such a huge response that, like the kid said in Oregon when I was talking to him on the phone, he says, "Dr. Kline, I mean, really, I don't understand why everybody's not doing this."
Yeah.
So people say to me, because we have the National Pain Council, we want to get people restored. Our goal is to get people back on the medicines they were taken off without their permission.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty nasty thing to do. That would be like me taking you into the operating room and operating on your back with no permission.
Yeah.
And in our business, we call that assault. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I saw your article about suicides associated with forced tapering. There was a list of 41 people. Yeah. This is from 2018, and the one guy was a Navy veteran, and there was a initiative in the VA called the Opioid Safety Initiative. Do you know? Is there statistics on how many suicides that has led to?
No.
Okay.
And it's hard to get.
I guess they wouldn't keep them. Yeah.
Well, you see, because of the opiophobia,
yeah,
the medical examiners write these people off as drug overdoses.
Mm.
Even though they didn't take drugs. Most of them don't. Why don't none of the 41 people took drugs to kill themselves? I don't think. Because they've all been cut off.
Yeah.
So they have to use ropes and guns, and one woman jumped in a freeze-cold river. My God.
Jeez.
She's up in Detroit. So I've been rattling on. Ask some questions.
Another one from that article. There's something they're using as an alternative pain treatment called spinal electrical stimulator. What is that? It doesn't sound very like it relieves pain. It sounds like the opposite.
Well, you remember the movie Frankenstein?
Yeah.
And they put these electric things in his neck. Yeah. Well, that's what they're doing. They're opening up your body, and they've got this electrical generator, and they put the probes right in your spine, and they shoot electricity up and down your spine, and it costs $40,000. And there's recently been some stories about people actually being burned when they tried to recharge the batteries. We did a survey, and it looks like it's only working maybe 20% of the time, and like half of the people are having problems. It's a terrible, terrible thing from a medical standpoint, strictly a medical standpoint. If you've got a $40,000 device with a lot of side effects and dangers, and maybe only a small percentage benefit from it, you might want to use it after everything else has failed. And that includes running up the opiate medication according to the FDA, to the point that it's not relieving pain and the person is acting inebriated. The side effect of too much opiates is acting drunk.
Mm.
So you kind of know, it's handy, really. You kind of know if somebody's getting too much.
Yeah.
You know, and if that fails, and the way we were all taught as general practitioners, if that doesn't work, try another opiate.
Yeah.
People are different. You know, people do well with this and that. You know, you try 3 or 4 before you would ever subject your patient to this dangerous procedure that only works 25% of the time. Now, there's a lot of articles written about it. Then we found out the doctors were getting $7,000 to $10,000 kickbacks.
Okay.
You know, so it's and
why
nobody
isn't that illegal?
this.
Shouldn't that be illegal to get kickbacks from?
Well, it is illegal. Yeah, if they catch you.
Okay.
Right.
Because I was going to ask, I mean, just how much, you know, I mean, big business, I don't think should be involved in medicine other than to manufacture it. It just seems like there's a lot of that going on. All these documentaries are accusing, you know, the pharmaceutical companies from pushing this OxyContin and whatnot on to people and overprescribing and stuff like that. And so that's what, you know, people think led to some kind of crisis of addiction. But as you said, it's not more than 1% like it used to be.
Yeah, that's a good point, because people are confusing overdose deaths with addiction.
Mm.
In other words, you'll hear coming out of the mouth of people, you know, even speaking before Congress, that we've had an increase in addiction over the past few years. The word addiction is not even in the CDC guidelines. And they say nothing in there about increasing addiction, only increase overdose deaths. But people think the overdose deaths are occurring in communities, and they're not. 95% are occurring in the heroin community. So you see how they have dangerously manipulated numbers so that now people have no pain control for their long-term permanent pain diseases, that when they lose function, we did a little survey, and we're going to do another one because I couldn't even believe the results. It said that 1/3 of people have applied for Social Security disability who've been taken off their medicines. In other words, you lose your function. And in my 34 patients, when we just restored the medicine to what had worked before, their lives were all put back together, all 34.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so people are desperate. I mean, they're flying across the country. 80% of doctors, according to a survey in Medical Economics, will not take a new patient who's on opiates. Now that means not take them further. If they come in and they've got a problem with asthma, they won't take them. They come in with a problem, they've got GYN problems, they don't take the ladies. If you're on these medicines, you are an untouchable. Read about untouchables in India.
Yeah.
The caste system. The CDC has created a new caste system in States called the Untouchables. We have a story of a woman who said that when she told her neighbor that she was on opiate pain medicine, the neighbor wouldn't let the children play together anymore.
That's crazy.
That's being an untouchable.
Yeah, really.
People are assaulted in pharmacies. The latest thing is to call people drug seekers. But you know that drug seeking is against the federal law, because drug seeking implies that you're trying to obtain medications illegally, opiates illegally. And that's a federal law. People go to prison for that. So people are yelling at, and by the way, 70% of people with these long-term painful diseases are women. Mm-hmm. And somebody told me it's because they have more pain receptors, which I didn't know. That's interesting. I wondered, 70%, that's a lot, So here are these house people, with families and house managers and people that work downtown, being assaulted in the pharmacy being called dope fiends.
Yeah.
The Andrew Kolodny, who is a psychiatrist from Brooklyn,
I've heard of him.
I heard of him. This is really strange. A single person, one person, got together with a small group of like-minded people, and they tried to convince the FDA to limit opiates, put a dose limit on it. And the FDA said, "No way, your argument is no good." So then Andrew Kolodny and his group, Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing, took their rejected ideas over to the CDC, and then they incorporated them in their guidelines. They incorporated things that the agency, who has the responsibility for prescription drugs, said, no, you can't do it. Mm. And they did it in a very sneaky way. And what they did, this is the famous 90 milligrams. 90 milligrams a day is only enough for a third of people with painful disease. The other 2/3 need more. So what they did is they wrote it in such a way that if you read it real quick, it would seem like anything over 90 milligrams is banned, or they are recommending. See, remember, it's voluntary. They're recommending anything over 90 milligrams is harmful. So if you read the section, it says, when we do not recommend doses over 90 milligrams, but if you justify it, then you're fine. Justify it. So all the doctor's got to do is put in the chart, I justify this. We need to go over this because it's not working. And you're fine. And then what? There's no more limits. So as soon as you bust through the 90 milligram gate, you can go to any dose you want.
Yeah.
I told a pharmacist the other day that I had a patient, 6'4". He was in the CIA. He was practicing a parachute jump and broke his back. And he got some terrible operation, and he's left with intractable pain to the point in his family, a wife and 2 kids, he was going to kill himself. And he studied how to do it. And he was going to put a bag over his head and run nitrogen in it. He was in so much pain, he was going to kill himself, and he had a family. For him, it took about 800 of the 30 milligram oxycodone to make it so he became functional. He became so functional that he got a job. He wasn't able to work. He wasn't able to do anything. So he gets a job as a 9/11 dispatcher. And then the pharmacy cut him off.
Oh, man. Did he kill himself?
No.
Oh, okay.
We don't have any follow-up.
Oh, all right.
It's so that's it. You see, we are going to eliminate junkies. So he was considered a junkie because he was taking a lot of pills.
Yeah.
And by the way, there is no study to show that more pills cause more problems. The FDA actually said, quote, there seems to be as many problems with low doses as with high doses.
Yeah.
In other words, they found a flaw on Andrew Kolodny's petition in 2012. And by the way, that's a document anybody can read. It's FDA 2012-P as in Paul -0818. It's by the way, if people read it, the first half of it has to do with some minor thing about long-acting drugs, which they did agree to, this change in the label. So you got to go to the second half. So sometimes people start reading it and they give up. But just get LA, it's called long-acting. Just keep going through it until you get past the LA stuff.
So I mean, so what do you think has to happen to get this get over this problem and this? I mean, because it's a long-standing phobia of drugs, and you know, they're kind of doing a reefer madness type thing with Kratom now, and you know, it's really seems to be so ingrained that it's kind of a hard thing to get over, that people need to understand that this addiction problems are very rare. Like you said, this type 2 addiction is genetic. And actually, I had a question about that. Is it always purely genetic, or can like childhood trauma lead to that sort of addiction?
Well, no.
Okay.
See, all those other things are in type 1.
Okay.
Now, you see that the odd thing about heroin disease, it's a cross section because, see, it's random. There is a warning for it that doctors don't bother to pay attention to. When they take a family history, in the office, do you have cancer in the family? Do you have anybody with a heart attack?
Yeah.
Those aren't particularly run in families, but the question should be, do you have serious alcoholism or addiction in your family? 75% of 35 heroin disease folks we did a little survey on, 75% said they had first degree relatives with the disease. That's a lot.
Yeah.
So no, there is, you see, you take your first pill like this Dr. Grinspoon in Boston. That's it. You're nailed.
Yeah.
Now there is a little window in there. In other words, let's say, and by the way, you have had a history of no opiates when this happens. Mm-hmm. This is the first opiate in your whole life. So if we had public education and everybody knew about this, and oh my God, you've gone to the doctor, come here, George, you're a teenager. I want you to take this pill here in the living room. In 30 minutes, you say, how are you feeling? If the kid says, I'm going to the moon, bam, that's the disease. And there's a window before the person really starts seeking more. In other words, you've had this one experience that's so wonderful you can't even describe it. And then you start thinking, wait a minute, if I can get some more of these, I can have more of these experiences. If you get them right then, you can stop all the deaths. Yeah. Because they won't be on the streets getting heroin. They'll be treated by addiction specialists. And this is where addiction specialists, come into play. Mm-hmm. Because if you break your leg and you have the addiction disease, what are you going to do? Not treat them? No. What you do is you give the bottle to somebody else. Yeah. You don't give the bottle to the person with the disease. So yeah, it just happens at random. I had an article from 1925, 25 after the Harrison Act. Mm-hmm. They were studying addicts and they said, it's odd. Some of them go to a doctor and they end up addicted, just like the people in the streets. Well, first pill. So kids need to we're going to try to do some education for the high schools because, forget the rest of the population. They're so opioid-phobic. A little story of a kid. He was 8 years old and he's driving this little bicycle down the street and this guy's got this Confederate flag hanging out, and the kid wheels into the driveway and he goes up on the porch. He says, "That's racism." In other words, you get the kids early. So we're going to teach the teenagers about this. And if people in the government don't want to learn about it, it's fine. But you see, you can prevent it yourself. If Peter Grinspoon, a doctor, had known about the genetics and about the triggering, when he took and then when he takes a pill, he's going to tell himself, this is the first time I've ever taken this. Then he's going to go to the moon. He's going to go, oh crap, I got the disease. Now I need to come in with a little self control here. So this is when the self control comes in. You got to stop realizing you have a disease. But if you realize you have a disease, it's a lot easier. Nice article about Jamie Lee Curtis. She was in her 30s, went and got some surgery. Somebody gave her some Vicodin. She went to the moon, and she ended up stealing for years and years. And had she known, whoa, I just went to the moon, that means I got this disease. Stop. Help me stop. Don't let me go for more. See, once you start taking it, then you got a whole different thing.
Yeah.
Because now you have additional behavioral addition, just like you did with cocaine. So now not only do you have this physical medical disease, on top of it, you've got the reinforcement of feeling wonderful.
Yeah.
It's like the reinforcement of feeling wonderful, taking amphetamine. So it's a double whammy. It's once it gets started, and it's like sex education. They didn't want to teach sex education because those have more sex. Henry Anslinger, this horrible person that ran the federal narcotics bureau for 32 years, started in the 30s, bad man.
Yeah.
I have an article in the New York Times back in the 50s where he came to speak before the city council, and he advised against education on drugs because he said more people will just use them. So back to your important question, what are we going to do? When you got a problem like this, it's like the problem of people disliking folks with dark skin. How are you going to change that? Well, how did they change it? They changed it by protesting and then by law. So there has to be protection for people with this problem. Now, at least half of the folks we know about with long-term painful disease are officially disabled, and that puts them under the protection of the American with Disabilities Act.
Yeah.
So they already have a law. So we need to look at laws. The DEA, which was created by the paranoid Richard Nixon in 1974, is the only agency in the government that has both regulatory and enforcement functions.
Yeah.
You can't have both. So in other words, when you hear of pharmacies being closed down and doctors losing their licenses to treat people with painful disease, like I did, that's regulatory. And then they think you can take the regulatory stuff and just flip it over, and the same agent can come and charge you criminally. You broke the federal law, we're going to take you to federal court. So that has to stop. The police department, and it's not their fault. This is the way it was set up, by Richard Nixon, who set up these laws to catch his enemies, because they stiffened the law for marijuana and for cocaine. And you could go to a meeting, let's say the Black Panthers, and look around and if you find one bag of cocaine, you can arrest the whole group on conspiracy.
Yeah.
So that's what it was, and the law needs to be changed. You can't blame the DEA because they're doing their job.
Yeah, they're just the cops.
As in the law,
Yep.
So, but they need to have that. The law gave them both functions, and that the regulatory or inspection function needs to go to somebody like HHS, where they would come around and inspect pharmacies, not a police officer with a gun.
Yeah.
These are specially trained, they're special agents, but that's their job. They have to, and they don't know what they're doing because they're not trained. They just get a few guidelines, and then what they do is they take them back to the Department of Justice, and they go over them, and they say, well, let's do some more investigation, and blah, 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 all under the federal statutes. So we have to change some laws. That's the way we got to do it. Talking like me on this show is not going to do it, and writing nice articles isn't going to do it because nobody reads it. The people who need to listen to this show today are not going to listen. So we're just doing this for ourselves, which is nice. And it's nice to generally get the word out there, because you know what it is? It's like fly fishing. You put the little fly out there on the water, and you hope there's a big fish underneath. In other words, we hope that somebody's listening to this that knows a senator.
Yeah.
Or knows a law group, that's willing to do some pro bono work. We got doctors in jail who sold no drugs. I mean, the law says you can't sell drugs, and that's reasonable because you don't have a license. But doctors aren't selling them. What the doctors are being sent to prison for is failing to detect criminals who are coming into their practice trying to purloin prescriptions and taking them off and selling them.
Yeah.
By the way, my prescription for this guy was actually 800 pills. If somebody could steal that, it would be worth $24,000.
Yeah.
One bottle.
So that's what happened that led to you losing your license?
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
lost my DEA license. I couldn't prescribe.
Okay.
controlled substances.
So you can still practice medicine.
I'm 77, so I decided to retire.
Oh, okay.
And you see, all of my patients were taking these medicines, so I didn't ever practice anymore. I mean, I had a specialty practice of just people with long-term painful disease, and I haven't really found anybody else that has. But I rescued people. We call them pain refugees.
Yeah.
And, fortunately, a physician agreed to take my patients, the same patients that got me into trouble. And the charges were, not following CDC guidelines, voluntary, unauthorized, but the state adopted them without reading them. Mm-hmm. And so they become the rule for the state. That becomes a problem because they're voluntary.
Yeah.
So the question is, if the state adopts a voluntary federal guideline, is it still voluntary?
Yeah.
We need a legal opinion on that.
Yeah, that seems
but anyway,
strange.
It was time for me to retire, and it was horrible because the DEA will not allow refills. All of my patients only had 30 days to find more medicine.
Oh, man.
And there would definitely been more suicides because I had the more severe cases. And when a person has a painful disease, they put up with it. Then when they get treated and they realize now they can function as a normal person, and if it gets taken away again, it's much worse. Because initially you're just doing the best you can. Now you know that you can be better. And so when you lose that, it's devastating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The reason this is worse than Guantanamo, which was also purposeful torture without consent, is that in Guantanamo, they take you down and dunk you under the water, or whatever they do for 3 or 4 hours, then you go back to your cell and you're fine. People with pain disease who've been pulled off their medicines aren't fine. They've got this 24 hours a day. One lady said that, she couldn't get off the couch, and so she couldn't make the lunch for her 5th grader. And so she just told her 5th grader how to make lunch. Can you imagine that? A mother whose responsibility is to make sure her child is dead, not being able to do it because some doctor took her off her medicine without her permission.
Yeah, and we get a lot of stories like that, like comments on our website, and they're just desperately turning to this Kratom, and sometimes you don't know what's in it. There's no standards. I had another scientist on that found toxic metals in some samples, so we're kind of pushing for regulation. So if people that have no other choice want to take something that they should be being prescribed, then it can at least be a clean plant material. So we get a lot. There's definitely a crossover community because I've heard a lot. I've had somebody with interstitial cystitis, complex regional pain syndrome, lady that almost killed herself if she didn't, and then this Kratom actually saved her. And I'm not saying it's better or worse or whatever. And then you've outlined the problem for many people who consume Kratom.
We're back to the caveman days where people are having to go out and scrounge up herbs.
Really, that's literally. I mean, because it's literally just leaves on trees. There have been cases of adulteration, just like I don't think it's very common. Kind of like with cannabis, it's not that common, but there are cases. Just like when people have to go out in the street and get heroin, and they don't know how much if there's fentanyl in it or not, because they either have that addiction or they're in horrible pain. Wish I could end it on a positive note, but I don't know if there is one.
Well, there's what I have. I have a little file in my drawer. It's called Redemption. And every time I hear a story, like up in New Hampshire, a doctor was sanctioned for under treatment.
Yeah.
It's starting to happen But we're going to need laws. We're going to need new laws. There is a hearing going on. Alexander, what's his name? Lamar Alexander's holding a hearing in the Senate for people who've been cut off and starting to hear these stories. The other way to get things changed is mass effect. So in other words, when the government starts talking about regulating kratom or taking it off the streets, you need a huge response to all the senators and all the representatives. And that can work. That can stop things temporarily, but it's really going to take laws. And we're also looking into nurse practitioners, as the doctors aren't participating, nurse practitioners, and making it safer for them. The government's not rating nurse practitioners as much. There's only 26 states that allow nurse practitioners to practice on their own, but that's one of the things that we're doing at the National Pain Council. And if anybody wants to join the National Pain Council,
put a link
and help out, just nationalpaincouncil.org.
Okay. Yeah.
And you'll get there and you sign up. It's confidential. We don't release names of members. We ask members if you have a particular skill, you can help us volunteer. The other day, a woman joined who was a pharmacist, and so that's helpful. Basically, our goal, like I said, is to get people back on their medicines that were taken from them illegally without their permission, and that they still need. This is what we call critical treatment. Abandonment. Abandoning patients is if you stop their critical treatment, even if you don't pick them out of the practice, you've abandoned the patient.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas Kline. Check out thomasklinemd.com, nationalpaincouncil.org. I'll have links to Dr. Kline's YouTube and Twitter. Music is Memories in Thailand by Risey. The Kratom Science Podcast is written and produced by me, Brian Gallagher, for KratomScience.com. Take care.